So we are looking at the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and we've looked at the Revelation chapter 20, and the first three verses being about how Satan's influence is limited. And so this is not the end of the world or anything like that. This is just after the Roman Empire has sort of brought justice. God brought justice upon them for what they had done to the Christians. It's this guarantee that God would limit Satan's influence for what's called 1,000 years, which just means sort of a long time, many years, and that he would be limited in a way where there's going to be less of his influence. And so verses 4 through 6 then are really focusing, when it talks about the 1,000-year reign of Christ, it's not Christ being on earth, it's not a literal kind of thing, but the focus is just that if Satan's influence is limited, then the Christian influence is unhindered, and that they're able to sort of go and preach and live without fear of persecution or without fear of anybody, at least from the government, trying to stop them from the things that they should be doing. And let's look for a moment at 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 12. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and in verse 12. There's Paul calls this a faithful saying, and he says in 2 Timothy 2:12, he says, "If we endure, we shall also reign with him." And that's really, you could almost call that the theme of the book of Revelation. If we endure, then we shall reign with him. And the idea of reigning with him is not that we have an authority that is equal to his or anything like that, but it's that we have that inheritance, like Romans 8 describes, that he has, that if we're willing to endure, to go through the hardships, to be faithful even when it's not the popular thing or the easy thing to do, then we share in his victory. And so in that sense, we share in his crown. And that's what it talks about in verse 4. He says, "I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was committed to them." Again, this is not the idea that they are ruling over the world or that they're actually passing judgment on people. But it's this idea that because they did the right thing, you're familiar in school with the bell curve. If someone makes 100, what does that do to everyone who made a 40? You're just stuck with the 40, aren't you? Right? People are pointing at other people in the room and saying, "This was that person in school." So yeah, that's if you got a 40, you're stuck with your 40. But if the highest grade was a 70, then suddenly your 40 isn't looking so bad, is it? Right? Well, that's the idea. They sat on these thrones, and judgment was committed to them. It's the bell curve. They were faithful through this terrible time. And because they were faithful, that by nature judged everyone who chose not to be faithful. It's the same idea as Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7. If you look in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7, I have birth on the brain, I don't know why that is. So Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7, he says, "By faith Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world." Right? Now, Noah is not the judge of the world, but when all the world did wrong, and Noah is the only one, him and his family, the only ones who did right, by nature of doing right, he's the bell curve. He shows it's possible to do the right thing even when nobody else does. And therefore, anyone who chooses not to follow God, they are condemned by the fact that Noah did it. That's the same idea here in Revelation chapter 20 and verse 4. And so they sat on these thrones, and judgment was committed to them. These are the people who were faithful through this terrible time. "And he saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the word of God, who had not worshipped the beast or his image." Right? We're talking about the people who would not compromise, who were faithful through this terrible time. They would not worship the beast or his image. They had not received his mark on their foreheads or on their hands. And so these are, he says, the souls of the beheaded who would not compromise through this time that they lived in. Now, beheaded, I think this can be taken two ways, and I think it probably should be taken both ways. Right? There are those who we could say were literally beheaded, and we saw them back in Revelation chapter 6, or at least they literally died. Revelation chapter 6, starting in verse 9, And in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 9, it says, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, how long, O Lord, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? Then a white robe was given to each of them, and it was said to them that they should rest a little while longer, until both the number of their fellow servants and their brethren who would be killed as they were completed. And so you have these people, and it says they were killed for the testimony of God. They were doing the right thing, and some government officials said, unless you deny Christ, or unless you disobey God in this way or that way, then we will take your life. And they said, take my life. And so they refused to compromise, even though it cost them their lives. I do think Revelation 20 kind of has them in mind, but I think that it's a little bit more than that too, because remember, what we've been looking at from chapter 19 is this figure of the Roman Empire ending and the church on earth having the victory over them because God punished Rome for what it did. And so when it says in verse 4, if you go on reading that last sentence, it says they lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The ones who are actually dead, there's no time, in a sense, where they are. Right? They're going to be with God up there until Jesus comes back to take them fully, and so right, 1,000 years is not relevant to them. I think beheaded is also a figure, as all of these things are figures through this section, is also a figure just for those people who suffered during the Roman Empire's reign. They didn't compromise. And so they are the ones who are going to, it says, live and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Now, we just saw the term 1,000 years a moment ago. Where did we see it first? How long would Satan be limited? All right, and I think that's important that we don't separate. Right? My Bible has a heading above verse 4. Sometimes when we have headings, we tend to forget what came before the heading and kind of exclude it from our thoughts. Not to separate that. Right? Satan is limited. His influence is less for this 1,000 years. That is just many, many years. And these people are living for that same amount of time. That is, while Satan is limited, they are not hindered. And much like it is where we live today. We don't worry about the government, not yet anyway, coming into our worship services and stopping what we're doing, or telling us that we can't preach the gospel, or we just go and do as we please as far as that's concerned. They are going to have that same victory. Melanie?
I may be off here, but I've always thought this area he's talking about the Christian era.
Yeah.
And then I kind of liken it to the rich man and Lazarus.
Mm-hmm.
You think along those lines.
Right.
Those people, this is what that parable shows us of what it would be like.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the same
yes.
thought here.
I think it is kind of the same thought. And I think you can deal with it on two levels. That's true once they get to the afterlife, to the waiting place. But then there's this element here of time. That's an earthly thing. And so we're also dealing with these Christians who survived and were faithful through this struggle, and that they don't have to worry about those same problems that they had to deal with before. And that's he's giving them hope is what he's doing. Why should they be faithful through all these terrible things? Well, God is going to make it right, and it is going to get better for them for that many, many years. All right, any other comments on verse 4? All right, verse 5 then, he says, but the rest of the dead, and again, remember, we're dealing with figurative language, and we're dealing with things that are happening on earth primarily. He says, the rest of the dead did not live again until the 1,000 years were finished. Right? Now, we know if they're talking about literal dead people, and we looked at this a couple of weeks ago, what happens to those who were literally dead but were not faithful to Christ? Do they ever live again in the sense that we're talking, right? They have no second life. They're condemned for eternity, and that's called, eternal death is what we call that. Second death. Yeah. And so the rest of the dead, we're going back to the end of chapter 19, and all those people who were figuratively slain, right? When the Roman Empire, when it went through the things as God judged it, people lost a lot economically. They lost their sources of income, they lost their fine houses and their fine clothing and all of those things. Right? They lost a lot. And he's talking about here, they didn't live again until the 1,000 years were finished. This is the first resurrection. And we have this kind of figurative thing of the wicked Romans who they're let's look at it this way. Most of the time, when we talk about the first resurrection, what is it that we think about ourselves? Baptism, right? That's raised again to walk in newness of life. Most of the time, we think of baptism, but I don't think that's what he's talking about here. He's talking about the resurrection of the church after the Roman Empire almost extinguished it. And so, right, we're talking about this time period where they thought, and there really was, where it looked like the church was just going to be gone, and that they had this kind of comeback, if you will. And so, for those who remain faithful, they're the ones who he calls in verse 6, blessed and holy. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection, right? Who were faithful up to that point. Now, if you're still alive at that point, is there a chance for you to repent and to also take part in life after that? Well, of course there is. There's that opportunity. And so he's dealing with these terms of resurrection, not in the way that we tend to think about them, but concerning nations, concerning individuals in those nations, and concerning whether or not they're persecuting the Christians or not. And so that's, again, if that's the case, then this is not Christ on earth, literally. This is Christ's people on earth reigning because God in his providence is able to make these things all work out. All right, I can tell that I'm not quite explaining this in a way that's making sense. But what questions or thoughts do we have about that as we're going through this?
I was just thinking the first resurrection is those who are on the throne now that we've already talked about.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Those who are on those thrones, those who are by their choosing to do the right thing, they're taking part in that first resurrection. That's right. And then he's going to talk about the second resurrection, verse 6. He says, blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such, the second death has no power. Right? Now, what would the second death be? Judgment, or even you could say their literal death has no power, because when they literally die, they're going to be judged righteous and spend eternity with heaven. David.
Pat had a question.
Oh, Pat had it. Yes, Pat.
Would you explain the 1,000 years and how it goes in context with the first and second?
Yes. Resurrection. Right. So then that 1,000 years, and again, that's figurative for just 10 is the number for many, and the more zeros you add, the many years, a long time of Satan's influence over this nation being limited, and the Christians being able to just go and do, to preach the gospel, to live their lives without that fear of the empire impeding them. So for a long time that's going to take place. The first resurrection then is when the 1,000 years starts. This is right that looked like Christianity was over, but there's this sort of resurrection, or this, they now have freedom where they didn't have that freedom before. Second resurrection described there is going to be the afterlife. Is that what you're asking about, Pat?
And the 1,000 years is figurative.
That's right. It's a figurative number.
It's a long time.
A long time. Yes, sir. That's right. 1,000 years just means a long, long time.
So the first resurrection is the church being able to come back. It's not resurrection from death.
It's not resurrection from death. That's right. Yeah, because you have these people who, it says that they've died. Right? They were beheaded, but they're living, and a first resurrection. So if we try to make this literal, all right, and just we'll kind of think this through. If we try to make, I'm sorry, Miss Loretta, I see you. Just one moment. If we try to make this literal, they've actually died. What two resurrections are there to follow? Once I've died, the only thing I'm waiting for is Jesus to come back and to resurrect my body. That's one resurrection. What would the second be? There is no other resurrection after that. We're told that's instantaneous and eternal. And then in context, of course, we've been looking at this is talking about the church on earth and the Roman Empire. And so it would be odd to jump to a heaven, talking about heaven, when we have not been talking about that so far. And that's why we spent some time earlier looking at, we don't get to Judgment Day until verse 10 and 11. We're not at Judgment Day yet. And so it would be odd to be talking about heaven and actual dead people when we haven't been talking about that in context, and there's only one resurrection to follow once we die. And that's why this has to be in some way about the people on earth. Yeah. Loretta.
So, figuratively,
Yes.
would we be in that 1,000 years today?
Yes and no. So, and this is my understanding of this, and I'm certainly open to different ideas on this, but my understanding of this would be that basically what he's describing here is what happens in rotation for the rest of history until Christ comes back. Right? That nations, and it could be different at the same time in different nations will go through periods where they are persecuted, much like India is today. India is a place where it's difficult to be a Christian, and the person they've elected to rule has said his goal, he was elected on the platform of stamp Christianity out. I guarantee you, anything that nation does to the Christians that's similar to what happens in the book of Revelation, God will make right. Now, Revelation is not about India, but the principles would apply to what they do there. He was going to do the same kinds of things to judge Israel and to bring about what's necessary for the Christians there. We, you could say in America, are in one of those sort of 1,000 years, you might say, or time periods where we have less impediment. Now that might end for us at some point and then come back again. Or, I don't know how that goes, but for the rest of history, this is sort of the rotation that nations will go through. They'll have periods of great persecution and periods of more freedom. And God always knows, what's best and how to judge those nations and what to do about them.
I think we can get pretty hung up on that they're wanting there to be it's written in stone that this is going to happen. Correct me if I'm wrong. If you're living the way you should, does it really matter?
It doesn't really matter. Yeah. If you're living the way you should, then wherever you are in this picture right here, you're just doing the right thing. God's going to work all that out. From that perspective, it doesn't matter, no. But it does matter as far as if we are teaching that Christ is going to reign on earth for 1,000 years, and that people who refuse to obey God are going to see that and have that chance, seeing Christ in the flesh, to repent. You think if we could see Christ in the flesh and have a chance to repent, but if we could do that, that's a false doctrine that's going to lead people to believe I don't have to do anything about my sins until Christ gets here. So that does matter. But just as far as doesn't matter where we are in history, that doesn't matter as long as you're just doing what you're supposed to be doing.
There are people that believe that he's coming to be here.
That's right.
And there is a second chance after that.
That's right, yes. And that's why we spent some time a couple weeks ago looking at, he doesn't actually ever come back to earth. He comes in the sky and takes us up there, and then instantly everything is over and judgment is done. He never comes back to earth. It just melts and goes away.
Do you recall about what period of time Rome fell?
Well, so I think there's a couple of ways that you could look at that. One is in about 315, he was asking when did Rome fall was his question. In about 315, the Emperor Constantine declared Christianity a religion that was accepted in the Roman Empire. And that changed every Christian's life because suddenly it was illegal to persecute them. And I think that is in part what he's talking about here, that freedom to go and to do. And then also following that through the next 100 or so years, the Roman Empire just sort of dissolved economically over time.
It was still a period of dark ages, and it was a number of years later before the church actually began to be restored again.
Yeah. Well, and it was that same man, Constantine, who then moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople. He named it after himself. How nice is that? Yeah. He moved, and Rome really was not an influence in the world at that point anymore. They were pretty much over when he did that. And so I would say around that time period, when Christianity became legal and he moved the empire away from Rome, That's really what we're looking at here. And just the economic ruin that came on those people who used to benefit from the Roman Empire's power and from, the persecution of the
I
Christians.
guess my point was getting to was,
Yeah.
we're already past the literal 1,000 years if we was going to look at
Yes,
it.
that's right. Yeah, past a literal 1,000 years, almost 2,000 now, not quite, but getting closer to 2,000 years since that happened. And so that's a good point. Okay.
Scott, one of the things that's pretty believing this now, these are the people who believe that faithful Christians are going to be caught up to a safe place, the church, for 7 years. And when they say the church, they mean the various church.
Mm-hmm.
That we're going to be taken out of the world for 7 years, and all these people are going to be mystified as to why all these people have disappeared from the earth, and that there's going to be a great tribulation come. There's going to be an antichrist. There's going to be a charismatic figure. And basically, as I understand it, they're predicting two more coming to Christ rather than one.
Mm-hmm.
The two things that I heard them bring up this weekend on a certain radio program I have is, number one, we who argue against that position have said that it started with a man named Darby, I guess around the 1830s. They are saying no, that doctrine had come into existence before him. In fact, there's a book called Dispensationalism before Darby. Number two, they said that they had been accused of promoting that there would be a secret rapture or a secret coming. They're saying, no, we're not saying that it's going to be secret. Now, I don't believe the rapture is an accurate doctrine,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm pointing this out because if you hear people arguing for it, and there are people who passionately believe in it, these pre-millennials, who think we're going to have this 7 years. Then after the 7 years is up, then it's going to be the literal 1,000-year reign of Christ in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
These are some of the arguments they are bringing up. They believe in a literal translation of the Bible rather than the figurative. And
Right.
so this is, we're talking along these lines, and so I just thought I would throw these points back.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point that those people, even who claim that Revelation should be understood literally, they still take some of it figurative. They're very consistent about that. And when you understand that, that these 19 chapters are dealing with the Roman Empire, it's pretty easy to see then that can't be talking about a future 7 years of tribulation. Yeah. And so just keep it in context, and then you don't have to be caught up in that confusion. But all right. Okay. Verse 6 then, he says, "Blessed and holy is he who has part in that first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power." And that's why I wanted to do this as a Bible class, because it is confusing. And I thought as we talked about it, hopefully it would become more clear. But that there is, that after death, there's only one resurrection to expect. And so this first resurrection must be about something different. It's about the church, resurrecting figuratively from that certain death. God had the victory in the end, even though it didn't look like he would to most people. And those who were faithful through it, that second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. And so they are God's priests. Well, we understand that. That's from 1 Peter chapter 2, that we are the priesthood of Christ, that we are those who make those spiritual sacrifices, and that we would, he says, they would reign with him. You go back to Revelation chapter 1, and in verse 6. In Revelation chapter 1 and verse 6, it said, well, we'll start at the end of verse 5. Revelation chapter 1 and the end of verse 5, it says, "To him who loved us and washed us from our sins in his own blood, he has made us kings and priests to his God and Father." And so he says, if you've been washed by the blood of Christ in baptism, you are a king and a priest. It's not just these people, but all Christians. And that idea of king is just you share in his inheritance. You share in all the blessings that he has to offer. And so they reign with him. Right? What makes a king a king? A king can do what he wants. Right? In this 1,000 years, they can live their life without fear. They can be Christians and worship and teach without fear. And that's really what we're talking about in those first 6 verses. All right. Any thoughts or comments, questions about that?
Well, a king can do what he wants, but within realms of the righteous.
Yes.
See that,
we throw
that out there, just like David did some things he shouldn't do. Well,
yes.
That's not what that's talking about.
but technically, while God didn't approve of them, he could do them.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and that's sort of the idea is
These are
that the
good
king is not
things.
limited. Yeah. So doesn't mean he's right about it. Just So okay. All right. So then, picking up then in verse 7, this is when Satan is released. So in other words, his influence is grown again. He's allowed to have greater influence over the nations. And so after this 1,000 years, this long time, Satan is allowed more influence again. Now, I think we talked about this last week, but we understand when it talks about Satan's influence and being allowed to have more influence. We think about the book of Job. And remember, could Satan just do things to Job just because he wanted to? Could he just take his family or his health away because he was inclined to? He had to get some permission to do that. And that God has good reason for that. You think about Acts chapter 8 and verse 4. In Acts chapter 8, the church was in Jerusalem and they weren't really going anywhere else until this great persecution. You could say Satan allowed God's influence to grow through Saul of Tarsus until this great persecution. And then what did the Christians do in Acts chapter 8 and verse 4? They dispersed and they taught the gospel to lots of people. And even more people were saved. That God could see that wasn't happening. They weren't going to go do that until he allowed Satan's influence in Jerusalem to grow and to drive them out. And so if God allows Satan's influence to grow, it's always because more people can be saved through that. And that's always God's goal. It's always salvation for as many people as possible. He knows what's best for the time period that we live in. And so verse 7, it says, "Now when the 1,000 years have expired, Satan will be released from his prison, and he'll go out and he'll deceive the nations, which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea." Right? So basically, he's going to influence the nations against the Christians, just like he did with the Roman Empire. He's going to deceive them throughout the book of Revelation and throughout the Bible. That's always how Satan works. How did he deceived Eve into eating of that fruit from the beginning? That's always Satan's kind of the way that he operates. The four corners of the earth just sort of represents, each north, east, south, and west. And Gog and Magog, Gog is a king, and Magog is his nation from the book of Ezekiel. And it's basically, they represent the enemies of God. Throughout the Bible, anytime you see Gog and Magog, they always just represent nations like Rome or like India today or any nation like that who are against God's people, who want to extinguish and exterminate God's people. And so, again, all of this is just figurative for Satan once again has some influence over the nations. And so he gathers them together for this figurative battle, and their number is as the sand of the sea. And again, we've pointed this out, but this has to be before Jesus comes back to end the world, because the wicked are as numbered as the sand of the sea, and they're on earth doing things. And so all of the things that we've looked at so far are before the end of the world. And so basically it's describing this battle, and it says in verse 9 that they went up on the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints. Now, who is the camp of the saints?
Church.
The church, right? And so it's not an actual place. It's just describing that the church is going to feel surrounded. And of the beloved city, right? Who is the beloved city? It's just another way to describe the church. And then fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. You might remember the story of, I always forget which, is it Elijah or Elisha? Elijah, who climbs up high, and the soldiers keep coming to take him.
He's on top of the mountain.
Yeah, on a mountain. The soldiers keep coming to take him, and he calls down fire from heaven and destroys the soldiers over and over again. That's kind of the idea here is, who saved Elijah that day from his enemies when they surrounded him? God did. God saved him. And so when it comes down to it, if ever we live in a society where we feel like the church is going to get completely extinguished and we can't survive this, and we've got to compromise in order to keep the church alive, don't forget who is really the one that's going to save us in the end from that situation. God, yeah. they surround the city, but the people in the city don't have to fight. God fights the battle for them. And so whenever we feel surrounded by our culture, whenever we feel like everybody in our culture disagrees and hates with us, which I think sometimes we do kind of feel that way, don't we? Whenever we feel that way, don't forget, God is going to work all of that out. He's going to save us from these troubles. All we have to do is just keep doing the right thing, keep being faithful, no matter the cost in this life, because we're going to have victory over that second death if we do that. And so this is kind of where we are in history, right? Sometimes in a nation, Satan has great influence, and I guarantee you in that nation, lots of people are being saved. And because you see that whenever there's great persecution, there's lots of salvation. Sometimes Satan's given limited influence, like where I think we are today. And it's going to be that way until we get to verse 10. Yes, Philip.
Well, talking about the church, the Bible says that the gates of Hades, and I understand, I think it might have been you that brought up the sermon that word, the King James word says gates of hell.
That was actually John that explained that to us, but yeah.
The actual accurate translation is Hades.
Mm-hmm.
The gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So the church is not going to go out of position.
No, and dying can't keep us from God and from heaven. That's right. Yeah, and so now notice in verses 7 through 9, there's no timeline that's given here. It doesn't say it's all going to happen in a minute or in a day. It says the 1,000 years is expired, but it doesn't tell us how long this is going to go on. And so there's no timeline given here. And the idea really is this is just going to happen all around the world for the rest of time until Christ comes back. That Satan is going to have sometimes great influence and sometimes small influence. But eventually, verse 10, the devil who deceived them will be cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, right? That's where God sent the Roman Empire and their religion. That lake, that basically it's the idea of eternal burning up. There's no way to get out of it. Yes, Miss Linda.
It's like now, everybody's saying we're in the worst times we've been
Right.
ever.
Ever.
And I think God may let something bad happen to the United States, like you say, to bring them back.
Sure.
Of course, maybe it's final, I don't know. Power of God would be fine. But anyway. But I'm just saying, we just have to keep, even as Christians, even if the times got that bad where we were being persecuted, God is working out the plan.
He is. That's right.
That's what we have to keep focused on, no matter what.
And that really is the point of the book of Revelation. All those things these people are going through, all these hardships, never forget from the 4th chapter, our view from heaven, God is always in control. He's always working it out.
We're sort of collateral damage.
In a sense, you could say that, yeah. But with an eternal reward. Yeah, that's right.
I've heard it said by more than one person that the central message of the book of Revelation is 2 words: God wins.
Yes, yeah. I think that's true. God wins, and you can share in that win. I think that's an important part of it too. But so here in verse 10, we finally get to the eternal judgment of the devil, because it says there they will be tormented day and night, forever and ever. Right. So we finally reached eternal judgment. There is no end to the torment of the devil. And then very briefly, verse 11, he says, I saw a great white throne and him who sat on it, right? So this is now God's throne, right? The great white throne and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them, right? If there's no place for the earth and heaven and they fled away, what are we describing here? I'm sorry. Yeah, the destruction of the world and the heavens. You could always just translate the word heaven, sky. In other words, universe, right? The physical universe, there's no place found for them. They fled. Peter calls that the melting, the destruction, the dissolving of the universe. And so we've reached the end of the physical universe. And verse 12, I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and books were opened. And the books are, God knows everything that we've done with our lives. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works. Now notice that the dead were judged according to their works. Right? It does matter. We can't earn our salvation. It comes through grace. But what we do with that grace matters, right? Our deeds, our works do matter. We are judged according to them by the things which were written in those books, right? Our deeds are written in those books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and the sea just represents sort of the culture that they were living in. And so, in other words, the sea is those wicked people who were still alive, right? The culture on earth. And then death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them. The wicked people who had already died, the wicked people who were on earth. Now they're all spat up before God, and they were judged, each one according to their works. Death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. Right? So if there's no more death, then we've reached the end of time, right? That 1 Corinthians 15 describes. Hades, that is the waiting place of the dead before the resurrection of Christ. Before we get to go to heaven proper. Well, there's no more Hades. There's no more waiting, is the idea. And they were cast in the lake of fire. This is the second death. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. And so if you were not washed by the blood of Christ through baptism for remission of sins and had not walked faithfully with God, then you were, and remember what it said about that back in verse 10, they will be tormented day and night forever and ever in the lake of fire. And it's just the idea of that eternal separation from God and the misery that goes with it. And then, chapter 21 and verse 1, now I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea, right? There was no more world for people to live in. And I saw the holy city coming out of heaven from God, right? Now he's describing what happened to those people who were faithful, whose names were found written in the book of life, that they were able to spend eternity with God. And that's verse 3. I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he shall dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them, and they will be their God. That we are finally in heaven with God. So the end of chapter 20 deals with the judgment and destruction of the wicked. Chapter 21 is the judgment of the righteous being brought into the presence of God forever and ever. Yes, and we actually, I don't have time to go into it as much detail as we did last time. If you want to look on like YouTube or Facebook, you can see how we discussed it in detail a week or two ago. But basically, it's a figurative phrase that describes moving from one kind of kingdom into another. So Isaiah uses it to describe the transition from the old covenant to the new covenant. And here it's describing the transition from the church on earth to the church in heaven. That's basically what that's describing there. And so, all right, a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ. It doesn't fit the figures of speech. It doesn't fit the context of the book of Revelation. It doesn't fit the context of the New Testament about Jesus returning. And so whether we're in a time and place of religious freedom or persecution, God is in control, and he's going to make it all right, and Christ will come back someday and end it all. And that's what this section of Revelation is talking about. Any last thoughts or comments?
One last thought.
Yes, sir.
When y'all were talking about, a lot of people do believe that there's Jesus is going to come and reign on this earth.
Yes.
And everything. So you got a good point about Lazarus. Lazarus came back. But what did it do? It just strengthened the believers that were there. Our Christ came back.
Oh, yeah.
Our Christ came back. He stayed 40 days here. What did it do? It strengthened the ones that were believers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it did do. And so the ability for them to get a second chance, a lot of these people, you have your chance.
This is the chance.
But no matter what Christ would do or Lazarus would do, it wouldn't make any difference to these people because they're living that lie that they will continue to live because only the believers in those hearts that are right with God will even be strengthened.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, plenty of people saw Lazarus rise from the dead, but not everyone was.
How about Christ?
Yeah, they didn't choose it, and so that's a good point. And that's this is our chance, and that's fair because we all get this chance. And some of us choose it, some people don't, but we all get the chance. And so we just have to make of it what we will. And that's his point here is make that right choice so that you don't miss your chance and you can be with him forever. All right, we will end it there. Thank you so much for your attention and your comments today. I'm happy if anyone has more questions about it, I'm happy to discuss it further.